during this session, sort of things that I would like to cover is first of all to consider what it is we mean by difficult conversations, because a difficult conversation for one person might be completely different to another person. So thinking about what we mean by difficult conversations and think about why we consider them to be difficult. To take a skills-based approach to exploring the mentor-trainee relationship, because that relationship is at the heart of absolutely everything that we do. But to look at that within wider frameworks, to actually say it's not just about you and your trainee in the classroom, it's actually there within a wider framework, two wider frameworks that we're going to look at today, the mentoring learning agreement and the teacher standards and the progress indicators that we use. And we're also going to explore the key communication skills of listening, questioning, to provide focused and targeted feedback that is constructive in enabling trainees to move forward and to progress. Okay, so we've only got an hour, and that seems like quite a lot to get through, and hopefully we will. But we're going to start off with that first question. What do we mean by difficult conversations and why they're difficult? So we're going to get you talking straight away. And with somebody sitting close to you, I would like you to consider the last time you had what you might term a difficult conversation with a trainee, and to think about the context that that conversation occurred within, how you introduced the conversation, and it might not have been you, it might have been the trainee themselves, the trainee response to what you were trying to achieve, and the outcome. But there is something to remember there at the bottom of that slide, and this underpins all our work in coaching and mentoring. By their very nature, these sorts of conversations are likely to be sensitive, they're likely to be confidential, so please, in your discussions, maintain that confidentiality and the privacy of all the parties involved. So we're talking generally, but based this on perhaps specific experiences that you might have had. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to talk in pairs about this particular issue. Okay. From the sounds of that, you've all had conversations. You all had something to talk about. So you've all had the opportunity to share an experience of having a difficult conversation. So I'm not going to ask what those conversations were, but what are difficult conversations? How might we sum them up? I was listening over here. I know Blair said the conversations you want to avoid and the conversations you actually want to have. So they might fall into those categories. Would anybody else like to sum up how you would define difficult conversations?
I think sometimes when you don't really know what you did, how you want to actually tackle it, to say something because it was so,
Yes.
Ridiculous. You're thinking, I can't say anything other than, what on earth are you thinking? It's that sort of thing. It's you're thinking, you've got your someone teaching and you're thinking, what have we just done that for? That is ridiculous. And you can't say that in that manner. So it's sort of.
So those are your thoughts. You need to rearrange those thoughts.
What you've got to say before you have that conversation, because you don't actually know how you need to steer that conversation immediately, because it was so out of the blue. It wasn't something you've ever seen before. Happen with a student, you're thinking, oh my goodness.
So it's a kind of conversation that isn't going to happen just naturally out of the conversation, the feedback that you might have. It's a conversation that you need to frame professionally before you have that conversation. Any other? Yeah.
I would say when they think something has gone really well and you don't. So when you've got that different perspective, how are you going to bring them around?
When you have that mismatch of perception, and again, it isn't just a case, although you might want to say, it's not like that, it's not how you thought it was, but in actual fact, you need to think about how that will be framed, how you will approach this. So these are conversations that do require thought beforehand. They tend not to just be on the spur of the moment things. So that brings us to the next question, really. Why are they difficult? Partly because we know we need to frame them, and you described that very well. They're out of the ordinary, they're unexpected. But are there any other reasons why we find these conversations difficult? Because we start to get to the crux of the difficulty by looking
I
at
would suggest that it's to do with an emotional response.
Right.
And where there's an emotional response either within you or within that person, that's what makes it actually very difficult.
Yes. I think that's an important point. And good to recognise that it's not just your trainee who might be emotional, but in actual fact, it's the emotional response yourself and how you might deal with an emotional response. Because it takes you out of that more comfortable relationship that you might have identified. Somebody else was, yes.
It's about ownership as well. They've got to recognise there's a problem and own the problem so they can find a solution for it.
Yes.
And if it's then just think as though it's you who have the problem, not them, then you've had it and they've had it as well.
Right. So if they're not willing to take responsibility, then that can be quite difficult then to think about how you move them into that frame of mind where they recognise there is a problem and are willing to take responsibility for that. There are also, I mean, thinking about ourselves as mentors, it's also about that relationship. And sometimes when things are going wrong, what you want, I mean, your purpose, if we think about what our purpose is, we want our trainees to achieve. We want them to succeed. And if they're not succeeding, then we start to think about our own practice. And quite often we apportion blame. Oh, what have I done wrong? You know, so they can be difficult questions because we can start blaming ourselves as well. So I think right at the start, what we have to think about is taking ourselves out of the equation in that way and beginning to see the bigger picture, to start to think about the frameworks that we are operating within. And we're going to focus on two frameworks. One is the mentoring learning agreement. So that mentoring relationship, how you start off, the kind of expectation that your trainee has of you and that you have of your trainee. The sort of entitlement that might be built into that mentor learning agreement and the expectation from both sides. So the boundaries of the relationship. And also, so that's the expectation framework, if you like. But we've got another framework that is vitally important, and that's obviously the teaching standards, because we are also assessing. As mentors, we have an assessment role. And that's the evidence framework. So keeping in mind all the time that these two frameworks give you a clear frame of expectation and evidence. And it's those two frameworks that we need to consider. So let's take the first one, the mentoring learning agreement. I've given out some sheets on your desks. There might not be quite enough of them. The principles of coaching and mentoring. This is taken from the DFES National Framework for Coaching and Mentoring. This document was written in 2005. Those of you who looked at the Carter Review of 2015 will see that it's calling for a new framework to be written. But this is the framework that we've been working with, and it's a very accessible document, a very useful document. So this is what we're drawing on today. And this mentoring learning agreement is one of the principles of mentoring and coaching that's identified on that sheet. A learning agreement establishing confidence about the boundaries of the relationship by agreeing and upholding ground rules that address imbalances in power and accountability. So, a task for you, because the very first thing when you embark on a mentoring relationship is thinking about that relationship, thinking about what the boundaries are, what the expectations are, what that trainee can expect of you as a mentor, and what you expect of them as a trainee. And it's no good if you don't talk about that, because if you don't talk, then you might have one expectation that that trainee knows nothing about. They might have an expectation of you that you know nothing about. So you might be starting this relationship by failing each other completely. So the first thing is to be able to talk about those expectations. What does it look like? So, in your groups, in 2s, 3s, or on your desk, think about what might be, if you like, the ground rules for this learning agreement. What might this learning agreement cover? We've got some ideas there, but what sort of things might you identify at the start of this learning relationship, this learning mentoring relationship? Okay, we'll give you 5 minutes. So perhaps if I could draw some ideas and we could sort of make some ground rules together. So what sort of things were you talking about? The start of this relationship, what sort of things will you talk about? Yeah?
You said that you start off with the expectations, what we can expect from professional mentors, subject mentors,
Yeah.
what we expect from them.
So begin with expectations. Because that makes it quite clear. You know, you're starting with something that is explicit. Any other things?
Talks about a certain degree of formality about the meetings.
Right. So to formalise the meetings, part of that expectation that there will be meetings, and these meetings might follow a particular agenda. That doesn't mean to say that that will never change, there could be flexibility, but there is a formality. This is not an informal arrangement.
Helen in my group mentioned the usefulness of, and David also, of writing it down at the end, or agreeing what you've talked about at the end of the meeting.
So, in all meetings or this first meeting? You mean they're sort of talking about expectations and entitlement, or were you talking about every meeting that you have?
I think we were mainly talking about the preceding ones, the difficult ones that might come after you've established the relationship.
Right. So, at the end of meetings then, to summarise what has been discussed. Yeah. So to summarise at the end of the meeting what has been discussed. And of course any action points or targets. Do we have any other things that you might cover in this first meeting?
Agree how you're going to communicate, whether that's by email, is it when you talk to each other?
Yeah. It's quite an important one. Because everybody is very different about how they deal with the issue of communication. Some people are quite happy to have emails. I'm going to fall over that at this point. I will just disappear out of camera. I'll be on the floor. Some people are quite happy to have emails at the weekend, be contacted on a Sunday evening. Some people would be horrified at that. If you don't make that clear, then your trainee won't know. And you might end up being really annoyed at being contacted on a Sunday evening, but it needs to be made clear. Other things, Chris?
On our table, we explored the importance of professional dialogue. We've been a dialogue in the way which we're actually encouraging a sort of a critical discussion of our own practice and also of the trainees' practice. Because it's really addressing that issue about the imbalances in power and accountability. Yes. There is an imbalance, and we have to acknowledge that. But if we see it as a professional dialogue, it's not us telling them what's good or bad about the lesson, but them actually drawing that out through our questioning of their practice.
That criticality doesn't mean necessarily criticism.
No.
That what you're doing, what your aim is to support and develop and to bring about progression. It's learning, it's a learning agreement, and the aim is to help them to learn. And that happens within a professional dialogue. So it's not personal, it's nothing to do with these with personality, it's to do with the issues of evidence of how somebody is progressing. And setting that then within that professional dialogue that aims to support and develop. So that's really important. And to recognise, of course, that it is all right within that professional. Mistakes are made, and they're part of learning. And that's part of that professional dialogue. It's not just criticism. Any other things?
Just following on from that point about professional dialogue, a lot of it is kind of modelling what those expectations, that professionalism,
Yes.
because they will hopefully take on from that.
So modelling expectations and professionalism. And we'll come back to this because in terms of how we might model and the sorts of things that we might model. So we've got modelling those expectations. So once you have this mentoring learning agreement, that is your role. You have explored then your role and also their role. And then you would expect you to model that particular role and that particular professionalism. And to talk through issues of professionalism quite explicitly. And it's back to expectations because all schools are different. And what might be accepted in one setting might be completely unacceptable in another. So it's being quite explicit about these professional expectations. So that sense of explicitness. Any other things before we move on? Okay, so we've got some interesting ideas there, the mentoring learning agreement and what that might look like. And if you have a look, this mentoring learning agreement is actually part of these principles of coaching and mentoring. And I've put some on your desk. Is anybody... I think there's a few more. Have you just done a few more? Oh, lovely. Anybody not got a copy of the principles? Anybody else?
Should I suppose copy some more?
Okay, so if we have a look, these principles then, if we have a look at these principles, they start to tell us something about the mentoring relationship. A learning conversation, a thoughtful relationship, a learning agreement, and we've unpicked that in some depth. Combining support from professional learners and specialists, growing self-direction, understanding why different approaches work, acknowledging the benefits to the mentors and the coaches, and we've talked about that as well, because as Chris was saying, that professional dialogue is looking at your own practice as well as the trainees' practice. Experimenting and observing, of course, by the very nature of experimenting, it might mean mistakes are made. If you take risks, then they can go horribly wrong as well as wonderfully right. And using resources effectively. Just having a look at those principles, what's beginning to emerge then about this relationship, about what underpins the mentoring relationship? What would you say? Any thoughts?
Something that's occurring to me is self-knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
For the mentor, and that way perhaps we would model
Yes.
for the mentee
Yes.
self-knowledge, understanding what makes you tick.
That's a really important point, because we talk a lot, and we are going to talk about reflection, and there is a sort of expectation, you will just go away and reflect. But for many people that is actually quite hard to do, and especially when you're in a situation that it is difficult to see the bigger picture. At the start of a mentoring relationship, when a trainee is just beginning, this idea of reflection can actually be quite hard. So this notion of self-knowledge, of the mentor's self-knowledge, and modelling that self-knowledge and ways of reflection is really important. Because that then leads to this sense of, we hope, the growing self-direction and the kind of reflection that the trainee might take on. Any other things that begin to emerge from looking at these principles? Because one of the things that always occurs to me when I look at this is it puts mentoring within this collaborative frame. That it's not something that is done to someone. It's a shared approach. And words like agreement, a learning agreement, this is not just somebody saying, this is what happens. It's a shared approach. The thoughtful conversation happens between two people or a small group of people. The collaborative approach of using fellow professionals. So this idea that it is a shared agreement, a shared approach, where you work together and you talk together and you set targets together. And of course, within this, and we talk about that shared collaborative approach, we're operating then, this relationship is happening, this learning, mentoring relationship is happening within the framework of the teacher's standards. So we are conscious then that assessment is part of our role as mentors. And that's one of the things that makes mentoring in teacher training rather different to other aspects of mentoring, in that assessment is very much a part of our role in what we do. And that framework is there always at the back of our mind. It becomes very important when we do have to have those difficult conversations, because what we are referring to is evidence. We're using the progress indicators, the teacher standards, but it needs to be that consistent application of levels using the progress indicators, right the way from the mentor, the class teacher, the professional mentor, the trainee, the university tutor. So it's that consistent application of levels that keeps it within this professional dialogue. It's about progressing against the standards. It's within that professional dialogue. Any implications for you for that? Any things that emerges in terms of this consistent application using progress indicators, using the teacher's standards?
Understanding them, knowing what they mean. I often hear that from teachers. Can you
Yes.
explain them? Can you tell us what they
Yes.
actually mean?
What do they look like in practice? So being able to use these, the progress indicators, and understanding what they actually look like in practice. So if you're looking at not quite good, what does not quite good look like? If you're looking at top end of good, moving into outstanding, what does that actually look like? So that in itself has implications. And what might, any thoughts about what those implications might be for schools and departments?
Training?
Training.
Yeah, trying to have that common understanding
It's that common understanding.
across the school. It's
Yeah.
quite difficult, I think.
Because I've put in not just mentors, but class teachers as well, so that those messages are consistent right the way across the school. And for that to happen, again, there needs to be talking, there needs to be discussion amongst mentors, amongst class teachers, but also with trainee teachers as well, about what these levels actually look like. And bearing in mind that it is an evidence-based course. And so it is a case of, all right, we're looking at good here, but where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Let's look, let's see where that evidence is.
I think it's also leads on to the fact it's really important that within the school, different teachers, different mentors are also having the same learning conversations. Because I think for me the most difficult conversations is where there are disagreements between mentors, professional mentors, subject mentors,
Yes.
between mentors and tutors about where a particular trainee is as well. So
Yeah.
it's really important that it's not just a discussion between mentor and trainee.
No. It's much wider.
Yeah.
It goes across the school. Everybody who has anything to do with trainee teachers will be using those progress indicators, those teacher standards. Every teacher is working with the teacher standards. So we are aware of them, but it's being aware of what that looks like in practice, and that requires discussion. So let's move on to then think about the role within these frameworks that we're looking at, the role of the mentors. What do good mentors do? Now, I'm sorry, this is a long quote, but I have highlighted some. I'm not sure whether you can see at the back, and hopefully you can. So my apologies for the long quote, and the reason I'm using it is it just encapsulates what a good mentor does, sort of the role itself. Good mentors need to encourage learners, that is trainee teachers, to take ownership of their development. And we've already talked about how difficult conversations emerge when trainees are reluctant to take ownership of their own development. Need to be adept at assisting in the evaluation process by being an effective questioner. And we're going to have a look at the role of questions. And listener. We'll look at that as well. Without being judgmental. So an effective questioner and listener without being judgmental. Thus, the mentor needs to help the learner to reflect on, review and refine their practice, and to provide opportunities to extend their repertoire of skills through the sharing of planning, observation of learners' practice and that of the mentor or other skilled practitioner, accompanied by explicit discussion of pedagogical decisions. So the bits I've highlighted in red take ownership of their development, encouraging trainees to take ownership of their development. The skills of being an effective questioner and listener. The skills of listening are absolutely paramount. The mentor needs to help the learner to reflect on, review, refine practice by the sharing of planning, observation of practice, and this explicit discussion of pedagogical choices. So being prepared as the mentor to say, this is what I did, but this is why I did it. These were the choices I made. Could have done that. I chose this because of this. And sometimes, actually, wish I had chosen that, because that didn't work as well as it could have done. So making those choices quite explicit. So that's quite a lot. So how does that happen? Well, we can look at Cole's model of learning and we can apply it to the mentoring cycle. So we can think about the role of reflection in here. And we talked about modelling reflection. And if we look at this cycle, it's about the experience. It's about starting off with having that experience. But then there needs to be some element of reflection, all right? As a result of having that experience, having taught that lesson, or that starter, or whatever it might be, planned that lesson, what have you noticed? What emerged for you? The conceptualization, what does it actually mean then? In terms of what have you learned from that you will take forward? So after that reflection, what have you learned that you will take forward and then apply into your next round of planning? And what will that look like? How will it make your planning look? What will be the difference? So that cycle of planning needs to build in that reflective moments, those reflective moments where we can start to really think about what did you notice. And we'll come on then to and that's the point where those key skills, the questioning skills and the listening skills, are really important. And in helping your trainee with the focus that they need, it's important to move away from generalistic observation. So there's absolutely no point to observation without critical analysis, so general impressionistic observations should be avoided. The whole notion of mentoring places the emphasis on negotiation and consensual planning, so surprise observations don't allow for this. But we also need to think about the role of the trainee in this. The process of identifying the focus ties in with that learning model of planning, implementing, reviewing, reflecting, planning. As such, it makes it vital for the student to be involved in setting the focus and beginning to identify what that focus is. And there was a study, and I'm always interested in this particular study, because the first time I read this, I thought, yeah, actually that does explain a lot. There's a study by Feynman Nemza, which showed that priorities set by the mentor alone are likely to be ignored by the student unless they coincide with their own priorities. So those of us, and we all have had that situation where I've told them to do this, I've said we need to do this, we need to do that, you need to include that, and they're still not doing it. The reason they might still not be doing it is they haven't yet identified that as the really important priority that they need to focus on. So that involvement of the trainee in setting the targets is really important. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit more quickly because I know we need to move on. Key features of successful feedback, and certainly the research tells us that focused and critical and supportive feedback makes all the difference. That's what trainee teachers tell us in the research, that focused feedback makes the difference to their progress. Focused observation that's targeted and that is shared, appropriate questioning techniques, active and observant listening, reflective discussion, and being explicit about those targets. Okay, we identified right at the start different categories of difficult conversation that we might have. So I've identified 3 students that we might say would generate difficult conversations. And we'll have a look briefly at these, and I'm just conscious of time. We will try to sort of speed up a bit. First of all, the administrator. The trainee teacher fills their lesson with lots of lively, engaging activities, but fails to do much actual teaching. The end result of this is that pupils might be going through all these activities but don't really know what they're doing or why they're doing it, because there was a fairly important bit that was missing, was the actual teaching, that whole class explanation of what the concepts might be or the learning ideas, because they think I'll get them started in the activity, then I'll explain it as I go around. So, teacher talk becomes limited to task setting, and the lack of teaching input means pupils don't tend to understand what they're doing and why, because there's little connection to their learning. Okay, very quickly then, what might be the focus in terms of your feedback? What would you focus on for this particular trainee? Any thoughts? Very quickly in your groups. So that was speed discussion. So any quick points emerging from that about the focus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Asking the question, what did the children learn?
Yes.
And how do you know?
Yes. It's shifting that focus away from the teaching and the preparation, which they've been so concerned about getting right, into the learning. You know, what are you actually here for? Well, you're here, so that the pupils will learn. It's about learning. So that shift into learning, how pupils learn, and what did they learn in that lesson, and how do you know they learned that? So that shift into learning would be really very important there. Let's move on. The defensive trainee. Mentor. Some further discussion about the strategies for identifying the key points in the passage would have been useful there, trainee. Oh, yes, but this was such a short lesson, and I knew that I wanted to get onto the main section, of the task, so they'd have enough time to complete. Okay, that's fine. Perfectly reasonable for the trainee to have a rationale for the choices that they make. Becomes a problem when this becomes a recurring response. And once this defensiveness becomes quite entrenched, then it does begin to impact on progress. So the defensive trainee, any thoughts then about how you might tackle, not just a one-off, because everybody, you would expect a trainee, you would expect them to have a rationale. But once you begin to notice this recurring response kick in, as soon as you make a comment that begins to explore their choices and why they made those choices, and those defensive barriers come up. Any thoughts? Any thoughts about what you might do with this particular training? Any thoughts? There are I could hear lots of different ideas, because of course, you'll all have come across this training, and we feel it in ourselves at times. It can be hard to accept. If you've worked really, really hard on something, and somebody comes in, well, maybe you should have done that. That's your first reaction, isn't it? And maybe, we can all be guilty of defensiveness at times, because we put a lot of effort in. But how might you tackle that as a mentor? How might you approach that? Did you have any thoughts about what you might do? I know there were lots of different ideas that I could hear.
I'll get them to say, perhaps agreeing that would look like that activity. Explain to me why you particularly wanted to get onto the main activity, and hopefully by that they could then see that perhaps there was no need for the first one, or they could have just done the quick book or something, and that they could just less is more, if you like.
Yes.
But get them to say, why did you choose that? And perhaps agree with them, so they're not feeling, I've spent ages planning, oh yeah, I like this, now why did you like this?
That's a really nice approach, because what it does is it shifts those questions back to the trainee. So it's not that end stop that it seems there, because you open up the discussion again with that open question. Like that activity, it was that was really interesting. Can you tell me a bit about why you chose to do it in this way? Because obviously there are always lots of different ways. We can make different choices. Tell me about your choice. So you're putting that focus back on the trainee. Chris?
I think in a situation like this, I always focus on the pupil's work and the responses. Let's look at how, because if in fact they made the right choice, we might say, oh, I would do it like that. Yeah. But actually, the children have learned, then it's not an issue. No. But obviously, if it has an impact on their learning, then clearly it is an issue. So, what other choices should we have made instead?
That's a really important strategy, because it shifts the focus away from the trainee. And so there is no need to be defensive in a way, because what we're looking at is children's learning. And there's lots, it's thinking about the best ways that children learn. And by shifting the focus away from the trainee onto the pupils, let's look at what they did, oh, so-and-so wasn't doing so well there. Is there a better way that we could have, what extra support might they have needed? So we're shifting that focus away. The spotlight is moving to where it should be, on the pupils' learning.
They also said that, if there's something specific in the lessons that's missing, if you send them to somebody else in school that's really, really good at that thing, give them a focus observation, saying, I'd like to go and watch this person for this reason, and then maybe send them to a couple of people and they can see it in somebody else's practice.
Yeah, so it becomes constructive. So that you're focusing on something that can be dealt with. It's not just what seems to be another criticism, but it's actually, let's follow this up. Let's see what are the steps that we can take to develop this. So it becomes something that is followed up with a focus that is developmental, that you can return to. If at the end of the day you're still not getting through and there's still a lot of defensiveness, then perhaps you need the dialogue about the dialogue. You need to be able to say, go back to the learning agreement. What we want to do, what we want to support you in, is your progression, your achievement. I have noticed that each time I suggest something, you're actually quite defensive. Why do you think this is? And it's having the dialogue about the dialogue. And that's one of the difficult conversations. But sometimes we need to do that. You know, if you've been through all the things that would be a good idea to move them on, and that's not working, then that's what you need. They are adults. We're very used to working with children, where we soften things. But these are adults that we're working with, and we need to be explicit. And if something is becoming a problem, then we need to be explicit about what the problem is. And that applies to the last point, the last trainee, the discounting trainee, the discounter. 4 types of behaviour that you might see. This is taken from Newell and Hughes in Trevor Wright's book, How to Be a Brilliant Mentor. It's a good focused approach to mentoring. It's an edited book. 4 types of behaviour. The trainee that is not doing anything, doing nothing, sort of seems to be stalled. The trainee who you might say something and then it's just over adaptation, too much so that you can no longer see what is going on. The trainee who responds with agitation or incapacitation or violence, but incapacitation at its most extreme, where they find it difficult to do anything. So those then who either will not acknowledge that there is a problem, they might not acknowledge the significance of the problem, that yes, it might be a problem, but it's not that important, you know, it will get better. Doesn't mean I'm going to fail, well actually. The possibility to change the situation, it's just how it is. You know, I was in the IT suite teaching poetry, but you know, that's how it is. I couldn't do anything about that. But also possibly their personal ability to solve the problem. And you might well have come across such trainees, and it can be very, very difficult. And this is where those skills of listening begin to become very, very important in terms of the feedback, beginning to hear those discounts. What is actually going on here? Beginning to listen to their response to what you are saying, because this can be, these trainees can be difficult, and they can bring about these difficult conversations. And so we need to think about how, if we have somebody who is discounting, who when you're saying, how do you think that went? Oh, it's fine. And even through all that reflection, all the probing, it's fine, nothing's going to change. How do we start to deal with those discounters? And we're back to having the dialogue about the dialogue. So if again, after you've been through thinking about this, the learning mentoring agreement, you've thought about the importance of reflection, modelling reflection, you've thought about targeted approaches to what the issue is, sending them to look at somebody else, coming back, looking at this issue and seeing how it's developed. If it's not getting you anywhere, then it's having the dialogue about the dialogue. It's being explicit. Notice the discount. That's where the skills of careful listening come in. Challenge constructively. And notice that each time I talk about this, you know, it seems that you're pushing it away. You don't want to acknowledge it. Let's talk about this. But explore, again, in ways in which the trainee might solve this problem himself or herself. Why is this becoming an issue? What can we do to actually make this less of an issue? Begin to explore constructive ways forward. But having that conversation is important. And if we set these difficult conversations within the evidence, the teacher's standards. So, you know, we've got problems here, we can see that this is beginning to affect your progress. Let's look at the evidence that's saying this. Let's look at the files, let's look at the observations. Our learning agreement is, you know, is to support you within a professional dialogue. So let's look at what this issue is and how we can move forward with that. Whoops. So we set all of this within a framework, and the framework takes account of the learner, who they are, what's important to them. Part of that mentoring learning agreement, you negotiate those objectives so you are involving the trainee in setting those objectives.